The Muroc Expedition. The report I held in my hand stated that in 1940 the U.S. Army had discovered a 7-level subterranean facility the size of a small city by chance, in the center of the Archuleta Mesa. This discovery came about when they began scouting areas of New Mexico for potential sites to house our atomic development and testing program. Didn't our atomic development start in 1942 with the Manhattan Project? No. You have to go back a little further than that, to when talks actually began in 1938. That's when atomic talks really started. It was by 1939 when FDR called up Lyman Briggs, a physicist who was in charge of the National Bureau of Standards, to head up the Uranium Committee. This was a newly formed State Department created to undertake all nuclear research. All of this began as a result of the Einstein-Szilard letter. That's the letter that set off a hellfire storm in Washington. You see, the letter strongly advised President Roosevelt to begin our own atomic development and research efforts because the Nazis were already researching the destructive power of nuclear bombs, and they were far ahead of everyone else, most importantly, us. This task was unlike anything else ever handled by our military and government, and everyone knew that special precautions and steps needed to be taken. At that time there was no CIA or DoD to coordinate and lead military efforts or intelligence operations. If you look back, within our government and military, information was very disparate at best, and already we had begun to see groups creating simultaneous teams duplicating efforts. For instance, there was no direction, no management or any control. At one point, no one knew for a period of time both the Army and Navy each had separate code-breaking departments, signals intelligence service, and doing the same exact thing. So, the prevalent concern was that this absolutely could not happen within a program as sensitive as atomic development. It had to be conducted under one roof and tightly controlled. Believe it or not, FDR himself made a damned good suggestion to ensure that only one branch would be running operations. He felt that since talks had already begun as far back as 1938 on how eventually the United States Army Corps of Engineers, USAS, would take over all real estate acquisition, construction, and maintenance for Army facilities by 1941, well, he suggested that they be in charge of assisting the scientists from the Manhattan Project, which was already underway as a small research program, and only them. This made sense because the Army Corps of Engineers had planes, soldiers, and the necessary resources required. Therefore he mandated that the Army Corps of Engineers alone head up the project to build up a secret centralized location to facilitate the scientific research of the Manhattan Project. So as a result, much of the information in the 1940 Muroc expedition is indirectly related to our atomic development program. All of this was occurring many months before October 9, 1941, when FDR gave the go-ahead for the development of an atomic weapon. So you see, the Muroc expedition was already in place, happening before anyone was aware. We were already ahead of the game. What do you mean by the Muroc expedition? That's right. You would have never heard about them, would you have? No, you would not have, so let me explain. With the Army Corps of Engineers now in charge of new facility development, they chose a special detachment of pilots and ground troops from Muroc Army Airfield out in California, which was still called the Muroc Lake Bombing and Gunnery Range at that time. This unit was quickly assembled, assigned the job of finding us a home for our atomic development efforts. Sadly, they'll never receive credit for what they did, or for what they discovered. It was the Muroc expedition who found the subterranean facility mentioned in the report, but they went off obscurely into history, because after making many of them were either dead, or reassigned to classified positions. Some were discharged. This was a group of men who didn't know what the hell they were getting into, and the fact that so many of them died after the discovery event, not during but after the fighting and with no official recognition, well, it breaks my heart as a soldier and as an American. Are you saying there was fighting back in 1940 at the Mesa? Oh yes, the news of the initial fighting upon their discovery of the location really created a stir back at the airfield. Eventually false information was given to those directly affected, families, colleagues, commanding officers, etc. to protect the location and to preserve top-secret nature of the findings. I thought you said that the Army had made the discovery? They did, don't get confused. You have to understand, this is before the Air Force was established. Muroc was an airfield, but it was the Army. Back in those days the Army held oversight of the vast number of pilots in the military. And it wasn't until September 1947 under the National Security Act that the U.S. Air Force was formed as a new separate branch of the military. Before that it was the USAC, U.S. Army Air Corps. Anyhow, in the report I read that what they found was that the upper levels of this facility were all but abandoned. The report also indicated that the initial exploration went forth successfully without incident even once deep inside the facility. Mostly in part because the soldiers selected were experts in various areas. This is going to sound very old-fashioned by today's standards, but the unit included geological experts, a surveyor, several trackers and cave experts, today they known as spelunkers. Anyhow, there were even a few very good sharpshooters on the team. For 1940 this was sort of an ad hoc special forces unit. The group was formed in order to serve as a ground unit with experts in various fields to complement the pilots flying overhead, determining where in the terrain the expedition team would go next. Everyone was hand-picked at Muroc. In the military you must be prepared for anything, and when this team was assembled, they intended it to be as a good team as you could create to help overcome the rough terrain of New Mexico. But by chance, unbeknownst to whomever assembled the team, they also created a unit that would be a pretty good fighting force, as they would soon find out. And you know what? There couldn't have been a better group chosen. The valor and bravery, and even the foolishness I read of in the reports from 1940 really tell me a lot about those men. Sometimes when I think about what I read, I almost felt as if I was there. Colonel, what did they find inside the facility? In the reports prepared by the soldiers, who were told to record what they had found, they discovered that the uninhabited upper levels held many of what appeared to be ancient artifacts interspersed among modern-looking but unfamiliar machines. Some walls were covered with radar-like screens, and there also appeared to be individual personnel stations, but mysteriously not large enough for any human to fit in, and some fitted with various sorts of cryptography machines, or what appeared to possibly be electric typewriters. All of these were connected to the flat radar-like screens. Hell, they didn't have a clue. The soldiers were not sure what any of it was or what it was used for. One soldier wrote, "Everything we are finding is highly sophisticated in design, way beyond our latest military electronic equipment. It looks to be German, possibly." The commanding officer wrote that in each room there appeared to be devices similar to electronic television sets, maybe German in appearance, but immense in size and very flat, covering most every wall near any of the equipment or electric machines. At first he thought these were windows, but he could see that these somehow offered a view or a screen to the many stations positioned in front of them. And the surface was smooth as glass. In fact, it was glass but had a liquid of some sort inside it, which seemed impossible because it was paper thin. In the same report it also stated that there were thick black cables with hundreds of individual lighted wires inside, as fine as hair. They appeared to be like glass but were physically malleable without causing damage, even when twisting or bending them. Extruding from the ends of the wires, the bundles of exposed glass wires with lighted ends, seemed to be receiving transmitted signals of some kind. There was a pattern to the blinking, but they weren't sure from what it was or from where it was coming. Upon following the source of the cables showed that they came from deep beneath the upper levels. Many were severed, seemingly removed through a rough extraction process, almost as if someone had cut them. What was strange was that indication by the surrounding evidence pointed to the equipment being hundreds of years old, possibly, and left undisturbed for that long. The curious ones asked, how could there be a power source? And this is where it becomes really strange. An area of the report that had me questioning not only if what I was reading was real, and what had me questioning. Why was I going to this place? You see, in addition to all the modern-looking machinery, The report stated that just past the cavern entrance and nearly several hundred feet inside they had found American Indian blades, discernible from the leather sheaths and cloth wrapping style upon handles made from bone. They also found over 100 arrows, bows and quivers, each dated to about the late 1800s. And this corroborated the few Colt revolvers and Winchester repeater rifles they found, still in perfect usable condition. Lying nearby there was both unused and spent ammunition, strewn about as if something violent had occurred in there. The report stated that the soldiers wanted to touch the artifacts, but the commanding officer, having the sense to preserve what they found for the experts, ordered them to not touch anything under threat of court-martial. The commanding officer wrote that nothing was right about this location. He felt everything seemed out of place, almost as if discovering anachronisms with each new room they entered. Futuristic machines, but easily capable of being hundreds of years old based on the way webs, dirt and dust had accumulated on the devices. It didn't make any sense. Once deeper inside the facility he also wrote that they found human remains. Some apparently were American Indians easily identified by their traditional clothing. But he stated that no Indian he knew dressed like that anymore. This was stuff that he swore that mid-19th century Apache warriors wore. At first they thought they could place the finds to at least the 1840s, but later they determined it was probably closer to the 1870s because of the Colt revolvers they found. The commanding officer wrote in the report, what were Apache warriors doing here and who were they fighting, and for what reason? He wrote that he told everyone to pull back and set up camp at the end of the first day of exploring the caverns inside and underneath the mesa. That night they slept without incident. The next day they made their way deeper into the caverns and noticed that the natural formations on the walls began to give way to a more structured and uniform patterns of large flat walls, made of some metallic matted substance. Interspersed between these segments were smaller segments where the walls had a smooth black layer of what appeared to be highly polished down conglomerate rock, almost granite-like in appearance, but different in that it had both a liquid and illuminant property to it. No one had ever seen such a material before. When you pressed your hand up against it, an illuminated print remained for some time. Some soldiers began writing with their fingers before the commanding officer ordered them to stop. What also mystified them were the rectangular windows with strange fluorescent purple lighting, almost lavender in color, and ice cold to the touch. And then, if it couldn't get any stranger, they began to find diminutive human-like remains, with enlarged heads and very large eye sockets, many of them strewn about the area where the cavern began to transition from natural cavern to a fabricated structure. All around the first areas surveyed, there were signs of a struggle and serious firefighting, as they found more weapons, dead bodies and blasts on the walls from having been shot at. But from how long ago the fighting occurred was anyone's guess. No one was sure exactly. The American Indian bodies were further out, but these new small human-like remains were being found much deeper into the facility. The officer wrote that maybe someone had chased them down up to this point in the cave corridor and then killed them. To know for sure, he wrote that they were going to need expert help. As they began to find rooms, more discoveries of equipment was made. These rooms, like the others, were also covered in cobwebs, dirt, and dust, indicating possible decades of lying there completely undisturbed. Nothing made sense. So the commanding officer in charge of the scouting expedition had enough awareness to call someone else in, a personal friend of his back at Muroc, a highly educated officer with a degree in archaeology who possessed a very methodical scientific approach to every aspect of his work. Within 2 days he was flown in, and with his help he was able to catalog and expertly remove everything with both precision and academic prudence, thus preserving all the artifacts along with meticulous documentation. From what I gathered from the report, the commanding officer himself was pretty astute and well aware of what he had discovered. His decision to place an archaeology expert in charge of the site recovery operation proved to be an incredibly crucial decision, vital to later successes in our own technological advancements. As I kept reading, I learned that in some rooms they found super thin metallic sheets which they called tablets, containing writing. These had writings which were etched onto the surface with machine-like precision. large paper-thin metal sheets of these tablets, acting as some advanced form of writing surface used to document something. The newly arrived office arrest team of scientific experts noted that the writing found on the tablets resembled cuneiform script from ancient Mesopotamia, particularly Akkadian's cuneiform. However, these figures seem to be much more compact in design and contain many differences not found in the known cuneiform. The commanding officer wrote that it was these men that began to call these writing sheets tablets, because of the similarity of the writing on the stone tablets discovered during archaeological expeditions in Iraq during the 1840s. But these tablets and the cuneiform were easily seen as highly version, well beyond the complexity of the Mesopotamian finds. And they observed how no living person could have done this work by hand. These finds were set apart from their archaeological counterparts found in Iraq. In the report it stated that all the equipment, machines, found by the soldiers had the same style of cuneiform but which included some different unidentifiable marking symbols, and there were a few other distinct types of writing styles found elsewhere, in other rooms too. I later learned that after some years of research by the U.S. Army and various academic experts, that they would fully translate the language and confirm that it was a highly advanced form of cuneiform inscription but with many variations and much more complex attributes than seen in Akkadian cuneiform, and it seemed to have an alphabetic structure more similar to the complexity of the later Ugarit alphabet. The markers for dating the cuneiform seemed to jump back and forth in time, but its roots were the same. Again, there was this strange aspect to nearly everything found. And the writing was not without its own mysteries. It would later be determined that the Akkadian and Ugarit civilizations used adopted forms of this language, and while crude in their own adaptations, very functional and seemingly to be directly from the language root discovered in the caverns. But how they got these was another question. Within a few years' time, both academic and military linguistics teams would eventually develop the ability to fully translate the language, and the Army would fund the creation of a translation device. The device was typewriter-like in physical design and it outputted the advanced cuneiform script in exact translations. A feat truly advanced for its time. But with regard to translation devices, that would all change dramatically just a decade or so later once we gained the full trust of the inhabitants. So in addition to this, their goal was to attempt reverse engineering of all the equipment they found, and to communicate with whoever was down there. Through the translation of the language, they deciphered the metal tablets, of which so many had been found nearly everywhere in the caverns and corridors which led to rooms. Colonel, who are the inhabitants? This is complicated as there were several groups we learned of, but only which one ever occupied the caverns. At first we did not understand why, but with time it all became clear. Now, with the ability to read their writings, the names of the subterranean inhabitants and other associated groups were discovered as was their entire history. Over time our researchers began to understand exactly what had happened at this location, understanding who these inhabitants and other groups were, and who among them was outside of the caverns. And we also learned how and why with all of their technology they were seemingly trapped here. Do you mean outside, as in, on the surface? Exactly, the lives of one group extends beyond the subterranean. The other group is everywhere, concentrated around various communities, and with a specific agenda. There were a total of 4 groups, today there are only 2. First are the progenitors, aliens from the Sirius system. Second are the Anu, possibly the same as the Anunnaki from ancient Sumer, their genetically enhanced offspring, the progenitors. Third is the Ostra albus, the offspring of the Anu. And finally the Greys, not related genetically to the progenitor lineage. If you will, there is a 5th group, modern humans, genetically modified for a specific reason. Colonel. Greys? Are you saying there are aliens in Dulce? Yes, Greys beneath Dulce and alien human hybrids up on the surface. 2 groups remain. Where did they come from, and how did the Greys get inside? Dulce? I mean, why are they there? The first historical reference discovered was to a group of beings representing a creator class simply called the progenitors, a powerfully advanced group of distant celestial origin. This group was often referred to by the others as simply the gods, the creators or progenitors. The origins of the progenitors begin in Zeta Reticuli, but for reasons unknown to the Greys, the progenitors left for the Sirius system. And the reason for that decision is not known. However, what is known is that the progenitors migrated and occupied 2 planets in the Sirius system from that point on. And this is where the Greys do begin to possess a clearer picture of their creators. For millions of years the progenitor race lived in Sirius before deciding to expand and investigate a newly discovered solar system rich with compatible resources, ours. Thus the progenitor group left the Sirius system for our own, the planet Mars specifically. Although desolate, Mars held a rich compatible atmosphere full of space for colonization. They settled Mars and thrived for 100,000 years. At the end of that time period, a catastrophic event occurred, so they abandoned Mars for Earth. When they arrived to Earth it was not ideal, the environment and Earth's atmosphere was all wrong, so they began to die. To continue their lineage they created a genetically enhanced offspring to cope with Earth's hostile environment, the Anu. They also created a servant caste for the Anu called the Aloa. In the tablets the Aloa were also called diachromatic and Formicidae. These would be your typical Greys. They were created to provide the Anu with a workforce gathering resources required to live comfortably. The Aloa, Greys, and also created to oversee the indigenous primitive Earth population of early humans. For reasons unknown the Anu became afflicted with the same genetic predisposition that caused a weakness in the immune system against the harsh ever-changing environment of Earth. To continue survival they needed to create a new better genetically enhanced successor group. The writings describe the Aloa or Greys as a newly created genetic subspecies of scant progenitor homeworld life forms, with no progenitor DNA themselves, created by the progenitors, at the same time as the Australopithecus, through a selection of predetermined traits extracted from alien life forms. This group was made to serve as a demigod for Homo sapiens, to be used as a method of control over humans, and as a means to avoid interaction with humans, although this prejudice changed. I don't want to stay on this area for too much longer, but here is the bottom line. The Australopithecus are a human alien offspring of the Anu. It's understood that today they are a secret cabal of select alien human lineages, and very powerful. They are a tightly controlled bloodline, of alien origin, stretching back thousands of years. Various people who today represent the powers that be amongst the ranks of humanity are members of this group. These are your Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, in England, also known as the Windsor, all of whom descended from the strict marriage based on familial lineage and breeding protocols, of a select lineage based to preserve the lines. All because of one reason, blood. From the special blood attained through females of the lineage, due to certain hormones, it helps them to sustain their ability to withstand the environment. Additionally, they also use secretions of pituitary and pineal glands, from captured modern humans, which also acts as strong drug helping to keep them from succumbing to mental instability caused by environmental stresses and unwanted chemical influence. Sounds strange, but this is exactly what we learned from the Greys' writings, and the dissident Greys themselves. Colonel, how do you know these families are related to this Australopithecus group? The dissident Greys have warned us about which families on the surface are all Australopithecus. Those are just some of them, and also because the older writings tell us the original lines of Australopithecus and how now they are a strictly controlled lineage. And the last and most modern of the tablets we discovered created by dissident Greys just some 150 hundreds of years ago include data telling us which families are most prominent. The dissident Greys seem to have compiled lots of data using traitor Australopithecus operatives for centuries now. Our own intelligence also tells us that select members of each family have been identified within the ranks of various shadow organizations operating today. This means they operate within many of the secretive groups that ultimately culminate into today's global elitist ranks. What is also important to realize is that over the many years, the alien element has since been 99% eradicated and the remaining lines are now almost pure humans. But in addition to their knowledge and power, They also retain one genetic predisposition that can kill them. This is why they are seemingly so exclusionary and secretive. They have to be. Are there any other prominent American families? Yes. Colonel, with all the families you are mentioning, I have to ask you, are the Australbus the Illuminati? Maybe. Look, I don't know who the Illuminati are, however, they represent a powerful cabal, a secret organization that is based on bloodlines and mysterious origins, so the Australbus very well could be. But I am not going to make that call. All I work with is the intelligence I am provided. All I am saying is that the Greys have informed us that certain families, the world's most wealthy and influential, are Australbus. And why are the Aloha called formicate, which is a reference to ants? Is it because of their appearance? No. The Aloha or Greys were not referred to as formicate for their appearance as you might assume. Rather, the writings say that it is for their behavioral traits which were programmed into their genome, all within the context of their socialization and protectorate nature. It is how the progenitors created them to be. Also, what we know is that the Greys are in fact alien. Their genetics are not from here, nor do they come from the progenitor lineage. Their genetic makeup comes directly from the progenitor race's home planet. Today, however, the species represents a genetic integration and transformation from multiple sources. The tablets make no attempt to hide the fact that the Greys have, to some extent, shared levels of incorporated alien animal and even alien insect DNA, but again, no progenitor DNA. Their writings record that even we, modern humans, were modified by the Australbus. But whereas their genetic base comes from the progenitor aliens, ours comes from theirs, which was already heavily modified. And it is what separates us from all other life forms on Earth. We received critical elements of the Australbus genome and for very specific reasons. One more important note is that the archaeological teams determined that many sets of tablets fell into separate social categories and into two primary segments of the alien chronology. There was a pre-war collection of tablets, and a post-war collection. We learned that about 10,000 years ago there was a revolt against the Australbus by the Aloha, the Greys. Also, and unbelievably, the chronological calculations made by our researchers show that the Greys may have been living in various North American cave systems from as far back as 26,000 years ago. What prompted the revolt? It resulted from both treachery and betrayal within their groups. As it would seem, they are not so different from us after all. This is simply incredible. That, it is. You are saying that there is a history extending back thousands of years, maybe 100 to 200,000 years, with ties to the ancient Near East. Culminating to a discovery in the caverns of Dulce, right here in the southwest. That I am, and no, the chronology is closer to 1 million years. Look, everything I learned shocked me to my core and made me reevaluate our history, religions, and selves. You see, there is much more. Colonel, I do want to talk more about the two species, but can you elaborate on the fighting which you said occurred back in 1940? In our phone conversation you mentioned the discovery, but you also mentioned a hostile engagement. Yes. In 1940 the Muroc expedition, during their discovery, created a base camp inside the top level of the facility they found. They also set up a surface-level camp above the mesa tunnel entrance. Now remember, all of this comes directly from the piles of reports that I had access to. The report of the Muroc expedition was very descriptive and stated many events within days of setting up their camp. They began to explore further. The newly arrived scientific team would ask for as much material as could be extracted from the caverns. No one knew what this place was and if they would ever be back. As they made their way deeper into the tunnels and down to the second lower level, they had begun reporting sightings of people, so they thought. They called them inhabitants. The soldiers, by virtue of lugging around all their gear, could not help but make their presence known to whoever it was down there. Even as they tried to remain quiet and out of sight, they could sense that someone or something was successfully tracking the soldiers. But there was no effort to interact with whoever it was, not yet. It was reported that some tunnels seemed to be endless, as far as they could see. The descriptions said that the environment had low levels of subdued colored lighting, with a purplish hue created from some unknown chemoluminescence all along the upper and lower sections of the walls. They could see entrances to unused side corridors, other smaller tunnels, discernible by the shape of the emitted lighting near those entrances. The soldiers noted that the lower you got, the hotter and more humid the tunnels had become. The walls were wet from condensation, not so much in the upper levels, but extremely moist, even dripping in the lower levels. They said that the lower-level tunnels smelled a bit like a factory that made industrial chemicals. According to one entry written by a soldier, although the smell was bad, it was mostly obscured by the humidity which rendered their sinuses torpid. All the reports stated that there were incidents of the mysterious inhabitants peering from around corners to observe the soldiers, usually from a great distance, almost like shadows. This lasted for several weeks, but there was never real interaction, thus allowing the group to collect and remove as many artifacts as they could. Several of the reports independently wrote about how they were shipping these items back to Muroc airfield from makeshift dirt airstrips being used near the town of Alamogordo. As the artifacts were transported back to Muroc, new equipment and supplies were coming in. The artifacts were being catalogued and placed in a specially demarked area of a hangar operating as a warehouse for later study. But Colonel, what about the tunnels? Can we go back to what occurred with the Muroc expedition team? According to the entries from the commanding officer, they managed to hold camp without incident, accidents, injuries while exploring for a while now. It had been 3 weeks in the caverns and corridors, and everyone was getting real comfortable. But as the discovery and collection of more artifacts continued, they found themselves traversing much deeper and deeper into what they now realized were the lower levels. And the walls continued to just get more sophisticated in design as they got lower. By the time they had cleared out the second level and began moving into the third, they began to encounter what seemed to be noises from unknown sources. First it was a sound static or hissing noise that would last for several minutes at a time. This lasted for a few hours. Then a mysterious super-fast beeping sound would appear out of nowhere as if someone had deliberately set off the sound right behind you. No one could determine how this was happening as there was no one else down there, they thought. And finally, as they got deeper into recesses of the third level down, a nearly terrifying sound of wood began to manifest, then quickly disappear within the frame of a second. It would come and go, just like that, very loud and disturbing, unnerving the soldiers. This lasted for a couple of hours. Then the sound began to last for several seconds. The echo in the corridor made the sound even more terrifying. By the time the emanating sounds would reach the 5 to 10 second ranges in length, the soldiers could then tell that it was a collage of combined screams and cries, from adults and children, as if to warn the soldiers. These continued on for hours on end. The report mentioned that over a time span of 2 days listening to these sounds, one of the officers was able to conclude that what they were hearing was a recording as if from a phonograph being played repeatedly. He began to take note of various sounds he swore he had already heard before. He recorded down the times and any phonetically writable and recognizable occurrences he could. And just like that, like clockwork, on each 90-minute mark the sounds would seemingly repeat. He had created 3 patterns created of various sounds over 3 hours, and he had a fellow soldier confirm his findings. This placed the commanding officer at ease. It seemed that the horrible sounds were a recording used to deter the soldiers from moving forward, or deeper inside the tunnels. The description of the sounds was one of female humans suffering, interspersed with horrifying cries from children, and even men, terrifying noise. 2 men had to be escorted out of the caves and back up to the surface because they couldn't handle the noise. But the sounds, these sounds are of people, just how the hell did they get these recordings is what one officer seemingly kept writing over and over in his journal. Obviously, to some extent, the sound had gotten to him too. You could begin to tell that the men's writings indicated that they were very agitated. But those that could continue to write unaffected, noted that some of the recordings were sounds made by people, but not in any language recognizable to them. In any event, It was working, as this was irritating and growing on the nerves of the men. But then, just like that, it stopped. The stop coincided exactly when the orders were given by the commanding officer to pack up and begin vacating the lower third tunnel back upwards towards the entrance, as if the inhabitants knew the soldiers were leaving. But the report stated that 2 soldiers intent on going lower, and without permission from the commanding officer, caused what amounted to a deadly encounter over a period of the next 3 days. What I am about to tell you comes from the account as written by one of the scientific team officers who interviewed the lone returning soldier. It began when 2 men crawled down into the darkly lit tunnel area where the sounds had been coming from. They wanted to know who had been doing this, and why. As they got closer, the walls began dripping with condensation from high levels of humidity and combined heat, almost unbearable for the 2 men. And it got worse as they traversed downward and further in. As they made their way deeper in, they began to hear voices. They were the voices coming from the inhabitants. This scared the hell out of the 2 soldiers. The report described their language as a combination of whispers and clicking noises, similar to some of the exact sounds played in those unnerving recordings used earlier as a deterrent. While they continued on, the soldiers happened upon a group of inhabitants just past a round-shaped doorway near the top of one of the side tunnel which they had snuck into. Before being noticed, one soldier said that they witnessed up to 50 inhabitants in this one very large room. There were tables with what appeared to be lab equipment, and they seemed to be working, performing experiments or medical procedures on other inhabitants or animals, things not fully recognizable to the soldiers. In the heavy atmosphere of fear and imminent trepidation, so much had been going on that it took a few minutes for the soldiers to even realize that what they were seeing were not humans but something else, diminutive-sized people with enlarged heads and huge eyes. This scared the hell out of them. They were frozen with fear and could barely talk to one another at that moment of realization. On one side of this large room there was a wall with screens like more of the electronic televisions like they had seen in the higher levels, but with vivid colors and showing images of their base camp up on the first level. They were being monitored. They realized that these things could see everything that they had been doing since they arrived. The soldiers tried to make their way back out of the tiny corridor leading up to this vantage point that allowed them to peer in. But as they began to leave, trying not to be noticed, one of them dropped his pistol which he held in his hand. He picked it back up, but that commotion alerted the entire room to their presence. As they began to quickly vacate, one of the soldiers was grabbed and dragged into the room screaming. The escaping soldier pulled out his pistol and began to run as fast as he could. He could hear pistol shots being fired repeatedly from the other soldier who was now back in that room. He must have been shooting at those things. As he ran, he heard inhabitant voices right behind him which only helped him to dig deep and find the strength to run even faster, but they were coming after him and gaining ground. As he gained ground on the upper level he began to scream out. He said that he had screamed as loud as he could towards his group, but he knew he was still too far out to be heard by anyone. Still too far in the distance, he could however begin to see the distant lights from his base camp emerge. The other soldiers had packed up and were wondering where the 2 missing soldiers were, waiting to give them hell for making them stay longer. The soldiers at base camp continued to pack up and await further orders before making their way back up to the surface. They were oblivious to the screams from the escaping soldier. He said that as he ran, he screamed and began firing his weapon behind him hoping to kill whoever was chasing him. His shots finally alerted his group to his presence, and they, being startled by the shooting, began firing in his direction. Even as friendly bullets zipped right by his head, he cared less about getting hit and more about being captured by these things. What he had seen terrified him. The commanding officer wrote in the report that the soldier, upon reaching the group, yelled his head off screaming in utter terror. Before the soldier even realized he had made it back successfully, he was surrounded by fellow soldiers, pissed off at him for going out on his own. They in turn were screaming at him, "What the hell are you doing?" They said. "Why are you shooting quick and what the hell is wrong with you?" they shouted at the returning soldier. "What are you doing to me?" The escaped soldier belted. "Let go of me, let me go, goddamn it!" he continued. The commanding officer hurried over to the group, telling them to break it up and explain what was happening. "Can't you see what's behind me? Look!" he shouted. Just then, one of the soldiers murmured, "What the hell is that?" and in unison, they all turned towards the direction that the soldier was looking to see a wave of inhabitants with weapons headed in their direction. Everyone grabbed for their weapons and began taking cover behind the larger equipment, and some soldiers began to overturn wide metal tables located inside the cavernous area, where they had set up camp, positioning the tables as fast as they could to take cover. The commanding officer shouted, "Everyone, no firing, no goddamn firing of weapons, is that understood?" He continued, "Do not fire, just take cover and wait until I give an order, got it?" The men continued taking cover and loading their weapons, packing ammunition. And the commanding officer began ordering his communications specialist to radio for help. "Send for help now, send our position to the surface and get me some reinforcements down here ASAP. Tell them we are encountering hostile inhabitants." In the report it stated that the inhabitants moved in a slow and disorganized formation once they began to reach the soldiers. All of the inhabitants were quite small, but some appeared taller within their group, while others were much shorter. There was no exact size to these things. The inhabitants had somewhat human-looking bodies, but something was odd about their skin. Their faces, they couldn't make out their faces. And from the distance you could see their weapons begin to light up with a green fluorescent-colored glow, what would later be described as a chemoluminescence effect upon arming the weapon. They learned this by retrieving and studying one of the weapons after the incident. But this strange lighting terrified the soldiers, as they had never seen anything like this. The commanding officer had enough sense to immediately recognize an advantage. He shouted to his men that this would work against the inhabitants. In the dark tunnel these lighted weapons would serve as targets. As they got closer the tunnel grew quieter, except for the clicking noises which became more pronounced and faster. They were communicating with one another. The commanding officer could now give orders without shouting, as his own men had also calmed down. All eyes were on their commander, giving him their full trust. He had ordered all lights turned off. Two of the soldiers, the snipers, had been equipped with prototype night scopes that the army had been evaluating for purchase from Meg back in 1936, before tensions had seriously risen with Germany. This was an advantage the commanding officer sought, and why he had ordered all their lights be immediately turned off, to the dismay of some soldiers. He knew that with his two sharpshooters at hand, using the night scopes, coupled with the lighted weapons of the hostile inhabitants, well, he knew that they could possibly prevail. The soldiers, most of them, were gathering their composure as began to conceal their position with silence, making no movement whatsoever. Because it was now darker and quite impossible for the men to see, they listened intently for the commanding officer's orders. "Wait for it, just wait a few more seconds," whispered the commander. Once the inhabitants had reached to about 20 yards away from their camp perimeter, their weapons lighted up the room, so with a real calm voice and a simple gesture of pointing his now visible two fingers towards the inhabitants, the commanding officer gave out the order, "Fire." A couple of soldiers jumped forward and blasted their way to the front, encountering the inhabitants. They managed to hit a few, spraying bullets in all directions before getting hit with small glowing blasts from the inhabitants' weapons, leaving large gashes in the men's bodies, glowing liquefied areas where they had been hit. This scared the hell out of the rest of them, but they fought on. It was noticed that the inhabitants would not move forward beyond a certain area which led directly into the perimeter of the men. This behavior gave the men an advantage. The metal tables which they hid behind seemed impervious to the inhabitants' weapons, they could simply not be damaged. But the large areas of stockpiled equipment they planned to take were being blasted to hell. Those men quickly realized that they need to get out of there and behind the metal tables. One soldier who was stuck behind of quickly disappearing equipment decided to forego diving behind a metal table and decided to confront the inhabitants head-on. He sprayed them, killing several instantly, and then went hand-to-hand with one of the larger inhabitants. This creature was ferocious and was tearing the man to shreds, not using his weapon, as if deciding to torture the soldier rather than killing him quickly. As they fought, the soldier began to gain the upper hand as his fellows began to target that creature and hit him successfully several times. But these shots did not stop the inhabitant from grabbing the soldier and pulling him into a corridor. Once out of sight, you could hear the soldier scream like mad and fight hard. Within what seemed to be forever, which in reality was only half a minute at most, the soldier reappeared and had the inhabitant's weapon in his hand. He began firing from behind the inhabitants, and the soldiers began to take cover as blasts began to spray their area. Somehow the soldier knew how to use this damned weapon, and he killed quite a few before making his way back to the group. The inhabitants and soldiers fought over a 3-hour period before it finally ended. With the new weapon, many inhabitants were slaughtered quite easily, with only a handful of soldiers being killed or injured, mostly those who fought near the front line. It was suspected that the inhabitants thought the soldiers would be similarly equal opponents to the earlier combatants that they had faced, probably encountering the same types of weapons and tactics from the time period. But what they had not factored was that this group was a highly trained military unit with long-range automatic weapons, comprised of men who were disciplined fighters, trained to kill Nazis with no mercy. Following their commanding officer's orders, they won convincingly. Many of the other inhabitants' weapons were recovered, and the only living inhabitant, a severely injured one, was being observed by the soldiers who tried to communicate with it for several hours, slapping and punching it, before they were ordered to finally just kill the damn thing. This was the entry that surprised me the most from the report of this incident. The commanding officer had shown a strong resolve throughout this whole ordeal, maintaining a strong will for the sake of carefully recovering and documenting everything with scientific prudence. But at the loss of his men, and seeing the dead being carted away, I believe his inner soldier gave way to his emotions. So the lone living inhabitant captive never stood a chance of living. I am sure that later, his intellectual side would have felt bad over losing such a strange specimen. After the last killing, some soldiers noted that they witnessed many inhabitants retreat, with some turning away as soon as fighting began. The behavior observed was strange too, as if initially these inhabitants did not expect there to be a real fight at all. But the minute bullets were fired in rapid succession, many fled. And it was noticed that those which did flee seemed to be without weapons to begin with, and that their attire was different from those that had stayed, almost as if wearing lab coats. After the 3 hours of fighting ended, the men grabbed their dead and just the essential items they needed, including a few more important-looking artifacts, and especially the weapons from the dead inhabitants. "We got the hell out of there taking as much as we could," was written in the report by the commanding officer. He had indicated that some soldiers had recommended that they take advantage of their win and go deeper into the tunnel, but the commanding officer decided against it, until they could analyze everything that had occurred and determine who the hell it was they were fighting. The officer ordered that just 3 inhabitant bodies be taken back to Muroc. He told the soldiers to find the least damaged corpses and to bag them. Later, when they reached the surface, there was a feeling of relief and safe haven. Somehow instinctively they just knew that the inhabitants would not follow. The surface team asked about the engagement and began to take a head count of who made it and who did not, and they began documenting the stories from the returning soldiers. The dead were all accounted for. The army would have recalled the unit immediately back to Muroc, but the reported technologies they were finding down below were simply too important to be disregarded. And not everything had been collected, plus command back of Muroc wanted as much as they could recover. So one final series of exploration down to the 2 safer levels took place before eventually sealing up the entrance they had found, and cordoning off the entire area as a classified military jurisdiction. There was no more fighting, just an understanding that we were going to go down there, and kill anything that moved, if necessary. Something tells me that at that time the inhabitants now knew this as well. Things remained quiet for some time. Today, as I look back at the success of the campaign in 1940 as opposed to the devastating failure of the 1979 event, it tells me how much the inhabitants had progressed as if planning, so much so that they would fight with better success the next time. The bottom line here is the 1940 group had far superior armament than their Apache predecessors, thus they caught the inhabitants by surprise. Despite that, the report said that the Apaches had also fought well, killing many of the Greys based on the number of bodies they found. The evidence also showed that their earlier encounter with the Greys had them outnumbered by 1 to 10. The belief is that the Apaches would have prevailed had they just slightly better numbers during their fight. One has to wonder if they had how that would have changed things today. Because some analysts speculate that some Apaches made it out alive from their engagement with the Greys. Because of that assumption, back then in the 1940s the Army allocated personnel to meet with local Native American people to ask about events or stories where men had not returned from the Mesa area. The Jicarilla people have more to tell on the subject of UFOs and Greys than any other group on Earth. That has already been proven. Second to them are the Dropa of the northern Tibetan Plateau. But getting to them is far more difficult. Why the Dropa? Grey writings say that a much earlier Grey's civil war, that a group left for another remote area so to follow a different doctrine. These people somehow also interbred with humans the Dropa. We do not know much about them. Because of the war, the whole New Mexico plateau had changed and heavy importance was being placed on the atomic development work. Aside from that, ongoing analysis and reverse engineering of certain artifacts taken from the caverns had already begun. A new team from Muroc was created and a two-part installation was built. First, they worked to establish communication with the inhabitants, and secondly it was to learn as much as they could to cover every aspect of the inhabitants' language and technology. But before beginning, to maintain the integrity of the find and to add some level of consistency, the original commanding officer of the Muroc expedition and the science team created him. They all remained on the project. But everyone else was let go. All other soldiers were either reassigned or honorably discharged under strict confidentiality. Those who posed potential problems from either mental or emotional instability from the event were sent to the brand new National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And others who showed an unwillingness to keep secret what they had observed were sent to Portsmouth Naval Prison on charges of insubordination, posing an immediate threat to national security.